again, and welcome back to one of our online lectures here in World History. Today we're going to kick off ancient China by looking specifically at a lot of the geography of China. And we always say this, when we start every unit, we say we got to look at their geography to know who they are, because geography shapes who we are as cultures. So we're going to look at the geography, and we're also going to look at some of the culture of the early ancient Chinese. We've got one constructive response question we're going to look at during this. The question simply says, describe China's geography and give examples as to how the Chinese adapted to it. So we're going to look at ways the Chinese were really able to deal with the restricting geography that they have, because in a lot of ways it's not a real useful place to live, and I'll tell you kind of why that is as we get into this. So we'll have plenty of information we can use to answer this question. Our roadmap, what will we learn? Well, like I said, we're going to start with the geography of China. We are going to touch a little bit on some of the earliest dynasties. These will not be dynasties we will need to know for our test, but in order to start the story on the Chinese, we have to talk about the Xia, the Zhou, and the Shang dynasties. We will then look at the development of some of the Chinese culture at the end of this PowerPoint. All right, so here we're going to start with the satellite image of China, and you'll notice there's a lot going on here. Mainland China is right here. If you follow my cursor, you can see a lot of things going on. You can see the Himalayas over here to the west, along with India. See a lot of desert and plateau up here in the north. You can't really see, but the river systems kind of flow right in here. And of course, you've got water to the east, the Yellow Sea, East China Sea, and South China Sea. And those are all going to play a very big role in the Chinese kind of figuring out who they are and what kind of people they want to be. So let's set the stage here. China's first city walls were built 1,000 years after the walls of Ur, the Great Pyramids, and the planned cities on the Indus River. So if we're going to look at kind of an order of how these civilizations come about, China's the next one on our list. The one thing China does not have in common with those other civilizations that we've studied is they are still there. The Chinese are still ethnically Chinese, whereas the people in the Indus River Valley and Mesopotamia and Egypt have all moved on. The ancestors of the people who live there today are not the same people. But we can say that in China, China is still ethnically Chinese. So unlike most cultures on Earth, the Chinese civilization that began in China 4,000 years ago still thrives there today. That's really remarkable. With all their ups and downs, they've been able to keep their civilization together. You compare that to our culture here in the United States. Our country is maybe, with the colonies, roughly 300 years old. They are 10 times that old, over 4,000 years. That's very impressive. All right, so we're going to talk about the geography of China here. China's really isolated. The natural barriers that exist in China definitely isolated ancient China from other groups. And that's going to matter as you see kind of who they are and who they wanted to be. They had to rely on themselves, because those natural barriers isolated ancient China. So if we want to take this from a regional perspective, kind of like in the satellite image we just looked at, if you go east of mainland China, you have water. You have the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, South China Sea, and of course the Pacific Ocean, which gives you a natural barrier against invasions. No one really in the ancient time had mastered ocean travel or naval battles enough to be able to invade by sea. So that's an advantage. To the west, you have desert. You have the Taklamakan Desert and the 15,000-foot plateau of Tibet, which is over by the Himalaya Mountains. So if you want to move an army in from the west, it would be very difficult to do. To the southwest, you have the Himalaya Mountains. We saw those last unit, as well as on the map I showed you a minute ago. And in the north, you have the Gobi Desert and the Mongolian Plateau. So if you can picture China, you're surrounded by some pretty significant landforms. So it not only locks the Chinese people in, but it also prevents invasion from the outside. It's very rare that China has been invaded. And realistically, when they've been invaded by very close neighbors or even members of their own country. Mountain ranges and desert dominate 2/3 of China's landmass. So it's not exactly the most hospitable piece of land for farming. If we look at that specifically, here we can see on this map, what we've got in this sort of reddish color here is really the main portion of China where you're going to find any type of vegetation. But even within this circle, most of the vegetation is going to be right up in here. I'm going to talk about that piece of land here. It's really the land between the two major river systems that we're going to talk about. So let's go ahead and look at those river systems. As we've done, just about every civilization we've studied, going back to Mesopotamia with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and with, of course, Egypt and the Nile and the Indus and Ganges rivers in India, rivers matter. You have to have rivers to live because they give you that silt, they give you that farmland that's so necessary for survival. So we've got two main rivers we're going to look at, and the interesting thing here is they've got two names. So if you were adding these to your map assignment, you would have noticed that you've got the HUANG River, which is also known as the Yellow River in the northern part of China. And you can kind of see how it gets its name. If you look at the images here on the screen, kind of got this sand or silt that kind of gives it sort of a yellow color. In fact, the silt is called loess. So because of wind, because of the elements, this river has a lot of this in there. So it deposits large amounts of yellowish silt on the land for farming that we call loess. This loess is blown by winds from the desert into the river. And again, that's how it gets that name and that color. You can kind of see it here on the map. You want to see where the HUANG or the Yellow River is. Got it located right here in the northern part of China. Kind of takes this nice bend here, almost a 90-degree angle here, and then flows through China. The other river that we're going to talk about is the Changjiang, also known as the Yangtze in central China. This river flows east from the Yellow Sea, and it is the longest river in Asia. So at 3,988 miles long, it is the longest river in Asia. We'll go ahead and take a look at that on one of our maps in a little bit. Now, just like with any other civilization we've talked about, there are environmental challenges in China, especially with these rivers. First of all, you can have disastrous floods. Look at the image here below. That is not a pleasant picture. Obviously, some people are coming out to check this out, but disastrous floods can ruin homes, it can ruin farmland, it can do a lot of terrible things. Now, one of the environmental challenges of China here is that trade was very difficult. It's hard to trade with other cultures when you are so locked in because of the Himalayas, the Gobi Desert, the Taklamakan Desert, and oceans. I mean, just you have to become self-sufficient. So trade was difficult, so settlers became self-sufficient. We're going to find out that the geography did not make invasion completely impossible, as I mentioned earlier, but very few armies, other than the Mongols, are going to try and attempt to invade China. So that geography matters. China, in a lot of ways, is safe. They built the Great Wall to make themselves safer, but geography was good for them. It just didn't make invasion completely impossible. Now, we're looking at those rivers. So again, we're going to look at a different map here. You can see the two river systems sort of on this map. They kind of flow right in here and right in here, and then we've got this nice green land right in the middle. We call that the North China Plain. Now, you'd think China's a pretty big country, so they should have a lot of access to farmland, but that's not true. Only 10% of China's land is suitable for farming. And as mentioned, most of the farmable land is in that area that this arrow is pointing to, called the North China Plain between the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. So that's where you're going to find a lot of the big cities today. Beijing is an enormous city. Shanghai is an enormous city. Some of the biggest cities on the planet because they have access to the farmland provided by those two rivers.